It's time now for perspective. The territorial battle against the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria may be over, but the legacy of the group's reign is still very much alive, especially for those people whose loved ones disappeared during the self-proclaimed caliphate's rule. Earlier this week, in conjunction with Human Rights Watch, a group called the Coalition of Families of those kidnapped by ISIS addressed the press here in Paris to call for the international anti-IS coalition to actively help Syrian families in their efforts to find out what happened to their relatives. Well, I'm joined on set now by Nadim Houry, who is the director of the Terrorism and Counterterrorism programme at Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much indeed for coming in to speak to us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
Could you please start by giving us an idea of just how serious this problem is? How many Iraqis, how many Syrians are unaccounted for?
So there are still no official statistics which show that no one in power is really interested in documenting this. Local Syrian groups have estimated that more than 8,000 people were detained, kidnapped by ISIS, and their fate remains unknown. A lot of these families are still living in Syria, but there are many who went into exile, Turkey, but there are also thousands today in Europe. We've been working with them over the last few months to help them get organized because they had very high hopes that actually with the defeat of ISIS, they were either going to find their loved ones in prisons that ISIS would abandon or at least get some information. But they've been very disappointed because no one basically is taking their call to give them information.
And who exactly are we talking about here? Are these people who are fighting ISIS? Were these dissenters? Who make up the majority of those who are missing?
So it's a variety of profiles. Most of those that we have documented are basically what I would consider people who were the first to resist the rise of ISIS. And I don't necessarily mean resisting by military means. They were peaceful activists, media activists, who initially were anti-Syrian government. And then in the summer of 2013, when they started seeing the rise of a group which wasn't even known as ISIS at the time, which was, a lot of them were foreigners, they were bizarre, they started documenting this, they were filming them. And we started seeing in the summer of 2013 an effort by ISIS to kidnap all these sort of people who could actually resist their project. Some of them were renowned doctors in Raqqa. Some were writers, many journalists. And ISIS sent a very strong signal by doing that to say, we will not tolerate any form of opposition. Today it's essential to remember these victims. And some did actually fight ISIS. They picked up arms. Some were in the Syrian army, but also many were in what was known at the time as the Free Syrian Army. They saw ISIS coming. They tried to resist them. ISIS kidnapped them, and they disappeared.
And what exactly is it that you're now asking the international coalition against the Islamic State group to do? What concrete measures?
The families want to know. They actually have the right to know what happened to their loved ones, the right that's recognized under international law. Today, the international coalition and their allies in northeast Syria, the Syria Democratic Forces, have in their custody thousands of suspected ISIS members. Many of these ISIS members may have information about what happened to the detainees at the time of ISIS because they may have been responsible for security agencies or prisons. So the families are saying, please let us know, please ask these detainees, these ISIS detainees today, what happened to our loved ones. Two, they really want to have a focal point in the coalition, someone who could actually answer their queries. Today, some of the families are basically knocking on all doors. If they are in Syria, they're going to see local hospitals, local police stations, looking for their loved ones. They're saying the international coalition played a key role. We want to have one responsible body to convey our information and get information from. And finally, and this is why there is a race against time, local groups in Syria are starting to unearth many of the mass graves that ISIS left behind. But in the absence of proper, technology to assess these mass graves, in the absence of proper training, a lot of evidence is being lost. So these families are saying, please loop us into these efforts. Please make sure that these mass graves are dealt with in the highest, most technical way to preserve any evidence and any information about our loved ones.
And why exactly, in your opinion, is this the responsibility of the anti-IS coalition? Some might say this is up to the Syrian government now, the Iraqi government. Why should the likes of the US, the UK care about this particular issue?
Look, most of these mass graves, most of these disappeared were in northeast Syria. Okay, they were in Raqqa, they were in Baghuz, the last area. And the anti-ISIS coalition was the dominant force in retaking the areas. Yes, on the ground, it was mostly fighters from the Syria Democratic Forces, but the effective control, the air control, all the prisons where all these ISIS suspects today are being maintained in northeast Syria are with U.S. money. They have access, French intelligence services, U.S. intelligence services have access to all the interrogations. So yes, they have a moral responsibility to help these families. And when everyone talked about the fight against ISIS being an international fight, well, then the aftermath of that fight should be an international responsibility as well.
Now, as far as you know, what measures have already been taken by the Kurds, by the anti-IS coalition, by the Syrian Democratic Forces, as far as identifying the remains of victims that have been found goes?
So locally, the Syria Democratic Forces and the local councils that they have set up in a number of areas around Raqqa, they've started opening some of the mass graves. And I've seen them working during my last visits to Raqqa and other areas. But they're doing so in very difficult circumstances. They're pulling out hundreds of bodies, but they only have one forensic doctor. And he wasn't even trained officially as a forensic doctor. He was just a general practitioner who tried to pick up some skills in the process. The international community has not trained them adequately. There has not been any database that has been set up. So really, there's been very, very little. The only efforts that have been done so far are local efforts to deal with some of the mass graves. But we are very concerned, and the families are very concerned that the way this is being done, it's actually not very helpful because a lot of evidence is being lost. When you don't know what you're looking for and you're just finding hundreds of bodies and you don't actually know who might be missing in that mass grave, you're not helping in the identification process. So we're hopeful that there's going to be more technical support, more funding going to these local groups. That will be essential. But really, the key point here is you have to put the victims of ISIS, including the Syrian victims, the Iraqi victims, at the center of this post-ISIS period. They have a right to know. They have a right to be present during the trials of ISIS members because it is their loved ones who disappeared, it is their loved ones who died. And today they are completely marginalized. The families were telling me that they were hoping at one point that someone would put out a press statement, be it the coalition, be it the SDF, telling them when they took all these ISIS prisons what they found. And they say no one even bothered to put out a press release saying, we took these 27 prisons from ISIS. We didn't find anyone. We're sorry, but we'll continue to search. Nothing was told to them.
Well, wishing you the best of luck with your efforts. Nadim Houry, Director of the Terrorism and Counterterrorism Programme at Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much indeed for coming in to speak to us on France 24.
Thank you for having me.